welcome to this i24 News special edition. I'm Shachar Peled. We begin with breaking news. A Palestinian was killed recently when he attempted to run over soldiers at a checkpoint north of Kalkilia. IDF troops opened fire, hitting the driver and injuring a passenger. This comes after much of central Israel was shut down this afternoon as police searched for suspected terrorists that infiltrated from the West Bank. 2 men were reportedly apprehended. Now, in the next few minutes, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is set to make a formal address at the graduation ceremony at the Haifa Naval Base. While he is expected to focus primarily on the recently completed conflict with Hamas, his speech comes amid a renewed push to resume negotiations with the Palestinians. Joining me now to discuss in the studio are investigative journalist Martin Himel and Haaretz correspondent Uri Misgav. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. First and foremost, we can probably expect Benjamin Netanyahu's address to focus on the accomplishments of Israel in the fighting against Hamas, but can we expect any diplomatic surprises, Martin?
Well, being Netanyahu, I'd be surprised if there was a diplomatic surprise. The key word for him is status quo the whole way. And I think that the recent decision to expand settlements in the West Bank and in the Jerusalem area that just came out as an indication where he's standing in all this. I believe that there is one move that Netanyahu would go for, and that's some sort of regional conference to improve the situation in Gaza, reduce Hamas's ability there, but nothing spectacular on the West Bank.
The rabbit is already out of the hat, and that's the 4,000 new houses in the settlements. We will hear a lot about security. We will see fists. It will be another Churchillian speech about the region and the world, and that's what we're going to hear.
Well, after 50 days of conflict and fightings, we can say that, well, would you consider that there is any big Israeli achievement? Would you consider Israel a real winner here, or has nothing changed? Are we back to square one?
Actually, I think a lot has changed, but it's not on the peace process front. I do believe that Israel has achieved a measure of deterrence for maybe a year or two, or depending how quickly Hamas can somehow get through this Egyptian blockade and rearm. The faster it can rearm, the faster it's going to go back to the old situation. So I think a lot depends on Egypt. But the situation has changed considerably because it's not, Hamas is equated with ISIS, which is equated with other radical groups in Syria. And with David Cameron, the British Prime Minister, and even President Obama alluding to it, there is becoming a global perception of a radical Islamic threat against the Western world. It's graduating to the next level, and whether Hamas likes it or not, it's put into that pool. And similarly, I think that Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and subsequently the Palestinian Authority are going to align to some sort of group that's going to try to protect themselves from this threat. And dealing with Israel, coming to some sort of conclusion with Israel becomes all the more important. Whether Netanyahu will take advantage of that in any way, we'll have to see.
Well, taking a look at the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, do you believe anything has really changed?
It's not even square one, it's square zero. And Netanyahu will be capitalizing on the radical Islam. That works for him to avoid international pressure to do something. But Netanyahu's real problems and real issues are inside the local politics. Israelis are frustrated with the last war. We talk a lot about dignity and honor in the Middle East, and Israelis don't like to be what you call in Hebrew friar, or excuse my language, sucker. They don't like the results. It's hard to fool Israelis for a long time. This operation took, I think, over for 50 days. Mm-hmm. And even in the last day, the 50th day, there was still 100 or 200 rockets fired on Israeli settlements. And so Netanyahu now is fighting the inside front much more than the outside.
Well, let's focus on that for a moment. If we take a look at Netanyahu's security cabinet, it seems that throughout the operation, especially now after it, the divisions are greater than ever. Only this morning we heard Finance Minister Yair Lapid object those 1,000 acres appropriation from the West Bank. We hear yesterday the same from Justice Minister Tzipi Livni. Can Netanyahu re-establish control over his own cabinet, or are we looking at early elections, perhaps?
I've written that more than a year ago, we have two governments in Israel. We have Netanyahu A and Netanyahu B. This is a ridiculous government and a ridiculous cabinet. They can't agree on anything except on staying where they are. And so I wouldn't expect elections here. These guys have shown miraculously abilities in staying near the cabinet table and arguing.
I'll tell you what he has. I agree with that perception, but I think from where I am, because I've just spent a lot of time in New York right now, there's a whole other perception that works for Netanyahu, whether you like it or not.
Definitely.
And that is that David Cameron, the British Prime Minister, and even President Obama, very reluctantly, but certainly also Angela Merkel in Germany and the French, are all talking the same language now. They have the same enemy, and that's going to reduce any pressure of isolation, diplomatic isolation in Israel, or diplomatic pressure to relinquish territory or to stop settlements. That pressure is going to ease as long as this threat is considered big. There are hundreds of Europeans, thousands of Europeans in all sorts of militias, and Israel's intelligence service is very, very valuable to the Western intelligence services at this minute, and they're not going to raise issues like settlements and land and peace process at this time.
However, issues of the deteriorating situation of the U.S.-Israel relations has risen throughout these past weeks.
Well,
How do you sense it?
I think that's on two different levels. The deteriorating situation is more a relationship issue between President Obama, his cabinet, and the Israeli cabinet. They definitely don't like each other, and President Obama has sort of stuck it to Prime Minister Netanyahu, saying, do you want arms? Call the White House, don't call the Pentagon.
Yeah, so it's strictly personal.
I think, well, personal in a professional way, but on the greater issue of intelligence and arms and the financing the Iron Dome and looking at this very serious threat which could infiltrate into the United States, there's full cooperation.
Well, Uri, you mentioned also the Israeli public. Are we looking at an end of a Bibi King era? We've seen polls throughout the operation of a sink in approval ratings for Netanyahu. Has the public had enough?
I will maybe surprise my colleague here. I think Netanyahu era is coming to its end, and that's strictly because of internal politics. I don't see actually how Netanyahu can establish his base again. He's what we call the base. His political base was traditionally from the right. The right wing is frustrated with him. He thinks that the goals of the last war weren't achieved, that he stopped the army too soon, that he was hesitating. So he lost the base. He got some respect from what we call the center, or the vast silent majority in Israel, for not being too hasty in that war. But those people will never vote for him. And without establishing a new party, a new platform, I don't see him even running. The Likud party, it's quite amazing to see. Netanyahu is now the leftist through all the Likud party. He can't even have 2 or 3 MPs that will back him. Everything is shifting really right towards the right wing in the Israeli politics right now. And that's why we'll see Netanyahu now giving speeches in naval bases, because he will talk again about security and trying again to establish him as Mr. Security, because that's the only thing he's got left.
Well, let's focus for a moment about Mahmoud Abbas, Palestinian president, and his new peace initiative saying Israel should withdraw within 3 years from the West Bank. We hear this after yesterday's appropriation and after Israeli Defense Minister Moshe Ya'alon saying today that this would never happen. This means rockets from the West Bank into Natbag, into the Israeli airport, Ben Gurion. Is there any chance this Israeli current government would even consider this initiative, this proposal, seriously?
Well, I think you heard a very good answer in the last couple of days with that decision on expanding settlements. The greatest, I think, expropriation or taking over of a land area in the last several decades. So I think it's a pretty definitive answer that Abbas can forget it for now. And I really wonder who Abbas is talking to. I think he's more talking to the Egyptians, the Saudis, the Americans, looking at that pool, saying, look, I'm willing to play ball. I know you guys want this. I'm willing to play ball, because he's looking at them for support. So he might be addressing that more to his own colleagues rather than to the Israelis.
The answer is no. Not with this government, not with this prime minister. I'll go with him. Abbas is playing his own cards. But he said quite about a few months ago, Abbas said, I'm turning 80, I won't be here for long. Use me because I'm the best partner you can get. He can still play with himself.
Well, Is it Netanyahu with himself, or is it the coalition together underestimating Mahmoud
I think
Abbas?
all of us will have to mature one day, and including my beloved newspaper Haaretz, and stop expecting Netanyahu from what he can deliver. It's a matter of matureness. We expected him for years. We expect him for bold moves, for surprising moves. He's not capable of delivering.
He's not that type of person at all. He's a brilliant status quo person.
Brilliant.
A brilliant status quo person. The person uses tremendous ingenuity to keep things exactly where they are. And it does take talent.
Yeah,
but that's his goal. If it was for other issues, we'd see what would happen.
Well, not only the government, do you expect the Israeli public to be in favor of a withdrawal from the West Bank following these 50 days of conflict?
Well, I keep thinking about Ariel Sharon in the early part of the 2000s came with this unimaginable decision to unilaterally withdraw from Gaza, and how the right really cursed him over it. But do you see one right-wing politician who has responsibility? I know there's some talk on the side who says, let's go right back into Gaza and hold it. Some said they had to go in for a while, but when it's amazing how when these people suddenly get closer to the prime minister's seat, their rhetoric just drops in inverse way.
Well, they say it usually takes a right-wing prime minister to make this
Right,
kind
well,
of
so
step.
he made this unimaginable move, and if he didn't fall asleep, he probably would have made the same moves in different parts of the West Bank. He was certainly heading in that direction. And the person that followed him, if Ehud Olmert did not get into serious criminal problems, he would have probably followed. But that hasn't happened. I personally think, and I have no basis of sound fact to say it, but just on that perception, that sooner or later the quote-unquote demographic or apartheid time bomb will suddenly face Israelis. And I think when it really faces Israelis, you will see some form of unilateral withdrawal. But that's strictly my opinion, no one else's.
Uri, what do
I
you
was
think?
sitting in this same studio when Ariel Sharon passed away this year, and all we talked about was one word: leadership.
Yes.
Leadership, peace process need leadership. And it was amazing to see how in one snap, one decision, the whole public opinion has changed. He had huge support withdrawing from Gaza. I have to admit that this was almost a decade ago. And I think the carpet has shifted towards the right wing. The younger, amazingly, but the younger generation in Israel society is much more into the right wing.
Well, is Netanyahu strong enough even to make this step? Is he strong enough to make peace with the Palestinians?
He's very strong and very sophisticated for what he wants to do. But that's not what he wants to do. He believes the status quo is the best imperfect situation that you could have. That's you're heading towards a peace agreement will bring things worse, or totally isolating Israel from anything like that, or going back into Gaza would make it worse. But in his narrow view of managing the problem, quote unquote, managing the problem, he's brilliant at it. The question is, do you want that or not?
Just a few weeks ago I spoke, and that's personal, but I won't mention his name. I spoke to a former close friend of Netanyahu. I was so desperate to understand what this guy wants that I asked him, tell me, what is your former friend Netanyahu's main goal? What does he want? Where does he lead us to? And the answer was very simple. He wants to stay in Balfour 6. Balfour 6, that's the address of the Prime Minister's house. That's where he wants to stay. If he would sense that only a peace process will leave him in Balfour 6, it's like Downing 10, but in Jerusalem, and that's what he'll do. But I don't see any internal pressure to do that, not from the Israeli public, and as you said, not from the international public at the moment.
Let's take a look now at Hamas. We've seen through a Palestinian survey that their approval ratings have skyrocketed after this operation. They are very, very popular among Palestinians. How does this influence both the Palestinian Authority and Israel?
I'd like to question where you're getting the source of that.
This is a Palestinian poll.
Right. Well, so the question is how it's done. I mean, if it's done very much in the open, or if it's done with people having a measure of privacy, there's a lot of pressure to say what has just been said. It's not that easy to express their own opinion. I think that there are several opinions there, and one is that, well, that they themselves see this tremendous economic byproduct, the payment for this war, which is going to influence them for years to come. And I think that many people are wondering if that was worth it or not. And that's probably what we call the elephant in the room that no one wants to talk about. No one is going to raise this, but they all see the elephant. On the other hand, when it comes to sensibilities of standing up to Israel and fighting and making the Israelis uncomfortable, of course they're very popular. They fired on Tel Aviv, they fired on Jerusalem, unimaginable years ago, and they succeeded in doing it, and they weren't deterred. So I think that in some places they struck a chord in the Palestinian heart, but I think the elephant in the living room, meaning the massive destruction, is something that people are weighing also. They won't want to repeat very soon.
I don't have any data here, but I've got to remind you all again. We're talking in the Middle East a lot about dignity and self-respect and honor. And let us not forget that when you are bombed by Israel for 50 days from airplanes, from the air, from the sea, and from the ground, you want your dignity back. And Hamas, in a way, brought back some dignity to these poor civilians. Not only firing Tel Aviv and Jerusalem,